Today's episode is episode 218, and today's episode is called Self-Absorbed. So today I'm going to share some thoughts around self-absorption. I feel like this is something that can happen, especially if you're somebody into personal development or if you like to write. Even if you're a programmer to an extent, or if you are just into psychology, understanding yourself, if you're in therapy, there's so many ways to become self-absorbed or to feel like you're self-absorbed. So today's episode, I just want to talk around it, my experiences with it. I feel like it's a balancing act. I think naturally we all have a certain amount of narcissism, self-absorption. It's only natural. Because at the end of the day, if you didn't have a certain healthy amount of narcissism, then I think you'll just end up becoming a doormat to other people. You just start to slide into self-sacrificing, and you become a doormat and a shell of yourself in the service of other people who will take advantage of that. So I don't think that's a healthy way to operate either. But in saying that, I try and be aware of whether I'm going down a path of self-absorption or not. And recently I was thinking about that and thinking about things to be aware of that will help me to notice whether I'm becoming too self-absorbed. Some of the things that came to mind for me were it's presence in terms of your interaction with somebody else. So is that something you place importance on, that when you're with someone that you're actually interested in what's going on for them and you value having an honest conversation with someone? That for me is an indicator of somebody who isn't self-absorbed. I think if you're self-absorbed, you become so self-absorbed that you don't even think about what's going on for somebody else. I suppose I've recently kind of had experiences with this now, because I suppose I came out in some of my podcasts there last year. I was talking about alienation and feeling different and things of that nature. That's possibly why I took a break from podcasting for a while too. I felt like I slipped into a kind of a negative headspace in terms of how I thought about myself. And I just needed a break from things. And coming out the other side of it there now, like, I feel like that being different thing isn't as much an issue for me. So looking back on it now, I don't know, I didn't even know I was working on that fully while I was doing it. I don't know how long it actually took me to work on that. Could actually be going on for a few years. A few months anyway that I worked on it. But looking back on it now, like that, I consider that self-absorption if you stay in that for too long, if it becomes a neurotic pattern of behavior. So I look back on that now, and there's a certain amount that you need to go through. So I guess in this podcast, one of the main things is to have empathy for yourself. This thing is not easy to untangle yourself from certain neurotic thought patterns. So it wasn't like I had wanted to have that kind of feeling last year about feeling different and it being a negative thing. It was just something that was in me. I picked up, don't know exactly how, or I'm guessing there was a lot of stuff that went into that for me to start picking up, and that's how I felt about myself. But where I'd see it being self-absorption is the moment when you're not willing to work through it, and it becomes just how you are in the world. At some level, it's like you notice that being in distress will get you attention from certain people, and you just hold on to that distress or hold on to that pattern of behavior. That for me is self-absorption. You don't care about other people when you're in that type of space. Whereas if you're listening to this podcast, the way I go about things is that I move into things to the extent that I want to make progress in my life. So the only two options I had there were to ignore how I felt about myself and just pretend everything's okay, or I can go into the feeling, acknowledge it, process it, with the faith that something will come of this. I won't be afraid of this feeling anymore, and something will come of it. That was the approach I took. When you take that approach, you don't know how long you're going to be working through something. You don't know what momentum looks like or feels like. It's just the faith that if that's your intention, you will come out the other side eventually. So that for me, I guess I'm biased in saying this, but that for me isn't self-absorption. That's more introspection. Like I feel like if you're an artist listening in, that's where a good chunk of your art comes from, is moving through these feelings, processing these feelings. That we all have these types of feelings. I feel like that kind of just feelings that are difficult to admit to ourselves and to process and make sense of. So that for me isn't self-absorption. If you're willing to go through that, come out the other side with the intent that you're gonna, I suppose, create more depth to your character, because that's what I would like to see more in the world. More people with just a depth to them, and because what that creates is a space for more honest conversations. And for me, I suppose I just find that enjoyable, talking to people who I like, talking to unconventional people. There's a sense of a life lived in their own way, following their own path. Like I find that inspiring to meet people like that, because I guess it's also uncommon as well. Or it's not common. It's uncommon. So I quite like that. So I guess this episode here about the self-absorption is that looking from the outside, somebody looking in on somebody who is processing, making sense of their feelings, if they have no frame of reference themselves in terms of what you're doing, it can possibly look to them like self-absorption, or you being selfish and preoccupied with yourself. My experience has been more that I think the truth is more found in the more I've been able to process what's going on for me. It's the easier it has been for me to see people as they are in front of me more, because I felt like when I wasn't processing feelings, that I think I was actually more self-absorbed without knowing it, because you're just controlled and run by your feelings, and you're run by narratives in as well, because you're so afraid of certain feelings like anxiety, and that you're run by the narratives in your head. And for me, that makes you more self-absorbed, because you're it's not even something you're intentionally doing. It's just you don't have the bandwidth then to actually see people, and you can't help them with their problems either, because you haven't solved some of your own problems. So I think that's another way of looking at introspection, and what you're doing is it frees up space. You're actually solving stuff for yourself, and that allows you to help somebody else find their own way as well in that problem solving process, not to bury your head in the sand. So that's something I'd ask myself. If you feel like maybe you're becoming too self-absorbed, to be honest, I don't think I actually felt that way about myself. It was more I think I was looking at it in terms of some of the people that were irritating me a bit, and that's what got me thinking about self-absorption. Some people I was encountering, it was like there was an unwillingness for them to see what's in front of them, that all their energy seemed to be consumed in upholding whatever kind of thing that was going on for them. And that's what just got me thinking about self-absorption then, that I wouldn't like to feel like that's the way I've lived my life. That's why I guess when I ask myself a few questions, then maybe to check in with myself that I am not too self-absorbed. Because, like I said, there is a certain amount of narcissism and self-absorption in everyone, and I guess as an adult, many adults, I guess children gives them the opportunity to not be so self-obsessed. I don't have children, so I don't have that outlet that brings me out of myself like that. But I do. I'd like to think that I pay attention to someone if they're wanting to talk to me. Maybe I can be a bit self-absorbed in the sense that I don't engage in kind of social gatherings as much as, it's not even as much as I could, to be honest. It's just not something that, what comes natural to me is to have a conversation with someone, like if they want to have an open conversation. I find that enjoyable. What doesn't come so natural to me is putting on the word that comes to mind for me, putting on an act, because that was something I was thinking about recently. I was listening to actually a Candace Owens video on YouTube. She's a political kind of commentator in the US. She was talking about Amanda Bynes, I think it was. She'd gone through some sort of psychotic break, and she was just talking about how she wouldn't encourage child actors. She wouldn't encourage her children to become child actors, because her point was that it's destabilizing. The act of becoming an actor, it destabilizes you mentally. That the best actors are the ones that embody an entirely different personality. And I'd agree with that. So that's the method acting, that you take on an entirely different personality, and it can be destabilizing to the personality that you started off with. The way she framed it was that it takes you away from your true self, which got me thinking about my own life, because I went through my own psychotic break in my early 20s, and I wasn't a child actor, but I felt like I acted a lot to fit in. It wasn't because, of course, I was a child growing up. It wasn't a really conscious decision on my behalf. It was more, if looking back, and it's probably more of a survival thing, to fit in, to feel like you fit in. But that was my way of feeling. Like that's how I feel with social interactions. It feels more acting to me, and I just kind of felt like that was what was destabilizing for me, because she said the true self was, the impression I got was that she would be able to believe that the true self comes from living in a real world, and you're living in a community, and if you form your true self that way. I don't necessarily think that's true. I think that can be true if you're living in a very conscious community, but if it's in more of an unconscious community, I think there will be room for individuality, but there's a lot of stuff there that's just societal programming, the community's programming, conditioning, the collective thinking. And for me, that for me isn't cultivating a true self. It's very hard to define a true self. Obviously, there's no definition to it, but the closest I could get to it is a feeling of groundedness. That's what I would say is more the true self. When I feel like there's an acting kind of coming about in me, I feel a disconnect from that. It doesn't feel as natural to me. My actions and behaviors feel more mimicked according to like how I think I should act and interact with people. So that for me would have led into more self-absorption in my formative years, because the self-absorption is being fed by the need to fit in. Or I suppose what I've been doing with more of the introspection with this podcast, the goal has been more to connect more with the true self that you can't define. It's just more of a feeling. And with that, I feel like the self-absorption that was tied up in the social games falls away from me a bit more. That type of self-absorption. The introspection has grown. So on the surface, I mightn't seem like I'm engaging as much as I might have had before. I don't know. It's hard for me to tell because I can't perceive myself like that. But I feel there's a difference. It's just introspection versus self-absorption. I feel with the introspection there's a purpose behind it. With the self-absorption, it feels more. It feels more and it appears more mindless. Kind of just being trapped in your own world. It's superficial, I think, as well, the self-absorption. There's not much depth to it. So, I suppose that's the thing. Like, if you're going to have depth to your life, you have to introspect. From what I can see, there's no way to go deep without introspection. Whereas the self-absorption is just more on the surface, more mindless. So there are a few things that might help to keep in mind as you continue on your path, like if you're an artist or a psychologist or just having an interest in human behavior or interest in understanding yourself a bit better. And all of that requires introspection and a willingness to not just mindlessly fit in, to create your own mold, forge your own path. And yeah, I guess the things I went through there, especially last year around the feeling of being different, as I worked through it, and I feel like I've kind of come out the other side. I don't want to speak too soon, but I feel like I kind of come out the other side in that one. I was just maybe listening back to a few of my podcasts about the alienation, and because of what I'd processed, there were certain things I heard then that made sense of how I feel now. Like sometimes a feeling of alienation is just a signal to tell you that where you're trying to fit in, it's not a match. I was even listening to a podcast recently. I think it was done 3 years ago actually. Theo Von and Bill Burr. So they're two comedians that I like, but they're two very different personalities. There are two different vibes going on. Theo's a bit more chill, laid back. There's a lot of vulnerability to him, a lot of feelings to him that he shares. And Bill Burr is a bit more. There's a lot of emotional intelligence to Bill Burr, but he's also. I suppose he says exactly what's on his mind, and he's a bit more. I suppose the feeling I get from Bill Burr, he's a bit more. He'll run you over. There's less of a softness. There's more of a hardness, a harshness, more of a harshness to Bill Burr. And that's what I was just thinking of anyway. With sometimes vibes, they don't match. Sometimes a feeling of alienation can be a signal that where you're trying to fit in, it's not matching. There's not a match there. It can be a simple signal like that, but that's hard to take in and process. That type of information you're getting, I guess that's hard to take in. But I suppose that's where the self-absorption came up for me then, because when I was going through that, and even as I kind of listen back to those topics, I wouldn't like to stay in that space for a long time, because I think that's where it leads into becomes neurotic and self-absorbing. So if you're having this authentic feeling of feeling different, but it's a negative feeling, I guess this podcast is about saying that in my experience, it's been healthy. It's felt healthy to engage with that feeling, not to suppress and deny it, pretend everything's okay. But there comes a point, and it's not something you actually decide, but there comes a point where you've processed it enough and you've learned what you need to learn and you're starting to move on. Don't know how long that will take. It could take months, it could take a few years, I don't know. It's also dependent on how willing you are to face some harsh truths. But I think that I feel quite repulsed now at the thought of being like that moving forward. Because that for me is a self-absorption, and it's like everything's about me. It's like the tortured kind of soul, and it's fine to go through periods like that, but in my experience, from my point of view, don't want to inhabit that, because that's where the selfishness for me comes in. Like it's fine occupying that space to the extent that you want to be honest with your life, but it's not fun for other people to be around me like that. So I don't want to constantly be like that. I want to face things honestly as I can with myself, but have an underlying sense of optimism and hope that can be infectious for other people. I don't want to infect other people with pessimism or nihilism or anything like that. What I want to bring about is just like help to bring about some honesty in myself, but always have that sense of optimism as well on top of it. So for me that's the myth of Sisyphus there. It's realizing that life is futile, there is no objective meaning to it. But there's still no reason to not be optimistic and to appreciate life, to appreciate the finer things and appreciate simple things like quality of relationships with people. That's what I like to. That's what I try to emit as much as possible. I suppose it's connecting with your own vibe. So when you get more honest with yourself, I feel like you connect more with your own natural vibe, and in turn, possibly that's how you find your tribe of people. That's how I found people over the years that felt more like a tribe, I guess. Even though they haven't all been together, it's been different people, and there's a natural vibe to it. I guess I learned that a little bit through dating as well now and things. It's you can't fake that vibe, and it's difficult because you don't find everybody with the same type of with a good vibe that you vibe off of. So it's probably easier in the short term to pretend there's a vibe, but in the long term, it's just a lot of energy that goes into that. But anyway, that's the thing I wanted to talk about today. Self-absorption might be something that might have crossed your mind before, might have crossed your mind at all, but there are just maybe some insights that might help if you ever feel like you're in a space where you're thinking you might be a bit self-absorbed when you're just going through something that you're just going to come out the other side eventually. It'll serve you. So hopefully that'll help you to distinguish some things in your own life. So that's it for today. Thanks again for listening, and I will speak to you on the next episode.